I'm not sure if you've heard us say this, but we are in fact on Patreon, patreon.com/so much crime, so little time. Join us there. You can join us as a member, or you can join us and support us. Pay $5 a month to get extra stuff from us, to get early access to shows, to get a heads up on what we're going to cover the following month. So many cool things in there. Access to some artifacts from different cases that we've covered. When a serial killer in a small Tennessee town eludes justice for over 30 years, who do you call?
The FBI? Matt Hutchison? Batman?
Why not a group of high school students?
That's what happens in Murder 101. And that's what we're previewing on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time.
Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Dee, and in this episode we'll introduce you to Murder 101, a podcast from KT Studios and iHeart.
After that, we will tackle a true crime question of the week.
If you haven't listened to Murder 101, that's great. This is one of our preview episodes. We're only going to introduce you to the podcast and cover parts of the very first episode. There will be no spoilers for what's to come. You'll also find a link to Murder 101 in our show notes.
In our next episode, we'll discuss the whole series, but right now we just want to decide if this is a crime that's worth your time. All right, Dee, this crime happened over a period of time in the 1980s, early 1980s, but the case that gets us started in this first episode happened in June of 1981. So before we get into the story, let's hop into the time machine.
Excellent. Okay, Jeff, I'm going to take over for a second. I'm going to do a flat read. Is that what it's called? Okay. I'm going to do a flat read of a song that was number one for a whole month, the whole month of June in Ireland in 1981.
Okay.
In Ireland. Okay. I'm going to go for not the very start because the third line is the name of the song. So I'm going to go for the first verse. Heaven must have sent you down for you to give me a thrill. Every time you touch me, every time you hold me, my heart starts speeding like a train on a track. I love you, baby, and it's plain to see. I love you, honey. It was meant to be.
Am I supposed to pick up and keep singing?
Well, the next two lines are the name of the song.
This sounds like a familiar song, but also kind of sounds like every pop song. What is that song, Dee?
It's Shakin' Stevens. Have you ever heard of Shakin' Stevens?
No.
You drive me crazy.
Huh.
I'll send you the link. You can listen after.
I can't wait to hear it. I have a couple things for you. First off, in America, a song that was at the top of the charts was, I'm not going to do the lyrics, I'm just going to tell you what it was and see if you know the song. Betty Davis Eyes.
I can't believe you didn't do the lyrics. That would have been a great one, Jeff.
Was it one of your favorite songs?
You got Betty Davis eyes. I love that song.
It's a good song. Yeah. It's funny because I knew that song when I was a little kid because it was popular throughout the 80s and I didn't know who Betty Davis was for the longest time. But yeah, it's a good song. Okay. All right, Dee, I also had a couple movies that came out. So this was a great month for movies, June 1981. So the second Muppet movie called The Great Muppet Caper came out.
Of course.
Yep. Superman 2 starring Christopher Reeve, which was a real weird movie. Cannonball Run, which I actually never saw. Stripes with Bill Murray. That was a good one. And then the number one movie in June of 1981, which came out that month, Raiders of the Lost Ark.
I think I might have. That might be one of the most watched movies in our house growing up.
I mean, it's one of the best movies ever made, I think.
It's so good. So good. Harrison Ford. Not Clooney. Was James Bond at one stage.
Oh, he was in, that wasn't Sean Connery. He was in a different one. He was in Last Crusade.
Oh. That wasn't the most watched movie in our house because that's not the movie I was thinking of.
Okay, well, it's also a great movie. Anyway, before we wrap up the time machine, I want to also take a trip in the time machine over to the location of our story, which is Elizabethton, Tennessee. And I went on TripAdvisor to see what are the best things to do if you find yourself in this town, this small town in eastern Tennessee in the mountains. And the number one activity to do is whitewater rafting, which kind of makes sense. It's I read a bunch of reviews. Looked like there's some great opportunities to do that. Number one restaurant is a place called Main Street Pizza Company. And apparently from this one review I read, it is better than Brooklyn. So Tennessee really coming out strong for their pizza. And
did you say one review said it was good?
Well, the first review, a top review. This is what the person said. They said, when you get a pie right out of the oven on a day when everything is going perfect, the slices you eat are heavenly. Airy, buttery, cheesy, gooey, with just the slightest crisp. Give me that over the, quote, authentic stuff any day.
I don't know if I want my pizza to be gooey, and I also don't know if I want my pizza to be referred to as a pie.
It's a pizza pie. That's what it is. Pizza is a type of pie.
Oh. Is
also,
a hot dog a sandwich? Is this where we're going?
When airy is the first adjective, though,
I love the way you're like, we're not having this conversation. Airy, yeah.
All right, that's our
They're not the adjectives I want for my pizza, I don't think. Not saying that it's not good, but...
Before we jump into discussing this, let's talk about what this podcast is about. So, Murder 101 came out in 2024.
There are 12 episodes, each about 30 minutes long.
So the story centers on Alex Campbell. He is a high school teacher from Elizabethton, which is in eastern Tennessee, and his sociology class.
They investigate a 30-year-old cold case about a serial killer.
And in this first episode, we hear about them developing a profile of the killer. They study the victims, and they are on their way to trying to solve the case. All right, Dee, that's what this is about. Let's talk about this first episode.
Okay, let's start with the host. What's your beef with the host? Do you have any beef with the host?
I mean, who is the host of this one? This one kind of doesn't have a host.
He's not very present. He's in and out a little bit.
So there's Jeff Shane, who's a producer, who kind of has the first voice, one of the first voices we hear.
Mm-hmm.
But then most of what we hear kind of guiding us through this episode is Alex Campbell, the teacher, but then also that we hear from the students themselves.
Yeah, and we hear a good bit from the FBI behavioral analyst that they get called in, which is so cool.
Yeah.
I want to be one of those, and I also want to meet one of those.
Well, if you were one and you just looked in a mirror, you could do both at the same time.
Oh my God, so efficient. Yeah, I didn't think that there was any presence of a host, which I often like that, but I don't know. It felt like there should always be a common thread throughout the podcast, and as we hear from different people, we should always be going back to this one voice that's tying things together. And
yeah,
we didn't have that here.
Yeah, I think the closest thing we get to that is Alex Campbell, the teacher. And he does do that, but we get a lot of voices of students that are, sometimes they're introduced, sometimes they're not. So sometimes we know their names, sometimes we don't. I think we can pick up from context clues that, this is a student we're hearing from. People like the FBI agent that you referred to, like they get introduced, but they're usually introduced in the form of the storytelling, right? Like Alex Campbell talking about I needed to get someone from the FBI to help us out, and I found this guy, and then we hear from that guy. But there's no host kind of like holding our hand through it.
Yeah, I think I'm needy enough to want someone to hold my hand through it.
Did you say you're needy enough?
Yeah. I'm very needy. Yeah.
So you think that took away from the story?
That. Do you know, it was only coming towards the end of the story that I realized how we were missing that. So I don't necessarily think it took away from episode 1. I think a lot of episode 1's A lot of podcasts, when we're listening to the first episodes, we've heard the host take a bit of a back seat when people are allowed to tell their story. I just feel like we need that common thread. Like it's kind of hard to know where we're going for the next 11 episodes. But presumably we're going to hear from more people other than Alex Campbell. And so if we're going to start to hear from more and more voices, I would like the continuity of one voice.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I guess I just presume that the voice who will guide us is Alex Campbell. Maybe I'm wrong.
But maybe that is the case. And maybe that'll work out fine. And it's kind of interesting because it's just not really something since we started doing this, that we've really seen before.
It's definitely different. I think it definitely had a different feel to it. The structure of it felt unlike anything we've really listened to. And I think part of that is the structure, the way this is put together, but part of it is also the content, right? Like we're hearing about a high school sociology teacher and how he kind of guided his class into this process of researching this cold case. And I think maybe I just sort of didn't focus on that because I thought, well, this is a teacher. This is what teachers do, right? Like they lead the class. Maybe they lead it from behind, but they're still sort of like whether you know it or not, they're the kind of steady hand guiding us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe. I mean, it kind of makes sense given it's like his class.
I actually thought it made it odd that we heard from Jeff Shane, the producer, at the beginning and then didn't really hear from him again. I don't think he came back until the credits.
No, we heard from him like in and out, like very briefly throughout. And maybe that's what I didn't like. Maybe it felt like he was in and out, but it didn't add anything. So it was just confusing. Like there's no need. I think he introduced maybe the behavioral analyst at one point.
Oh, maybe. Yeah. So like, why have him?
Don't do that. You know, let the behavioral analyst introduce himself even, as opposed to just have that voice in. That was, I mean, look, I'm nitpicking here, but it was just weird. It was interesting. It was different. I'm intrigued to see how that plays out in the next 11 episodes. On the note of 11 episodes, I'm kind of... Look, the plot here is right up my alley. I presume it's right up yours as well. We're both from a teaching background, education background. So for me, it's definitely marrying my love for education and teaching and true crime in kind of the best way. But it's, I don't know, 12 episodes is a lot. And we covered so much in the first episode. I'm intrigued to see how this is spread over 12 episodes.
I actually had the same reaction because I thought that when I got to the end of the first episode, I thought, well, okay, if we just kind of roughly outline what happens in the first episode. So we get introduced to the teacher. We get introduced to kind of his style of teaching. We hear about how he's really interested in project-based learning. He teaches this sociology class. We hear about how the students their first impressions of the class. And then we get into this case where there was this woman, Cynthia Taylor. So she was a 16-year-old girl who, is one of the most famous, I guess, murders for locals in this area. That's an unsolved murder. And we hear how Alex Campbell kind of like went from this to realizing that there were these other murders that were unsolved that maybe were related, maybe weren't related. And then we get into the class kind of trying to piece together like, okay, which ones of these are connected, which ones of these aren't connected, and then build this profile of this killer. It's a lot that happens in a relatively short amount. And by the end of it, what we've got, the class is like totally bought in. They're totally excited about this. We've heard from the FBI. We've heard the profile of the killer. We've heard a little bit about which of the victims they determined were connected. I feel like we have most of the story, but I'm presuming we don't, right? Otherwise there wouldn't be 11 more episodes. But yeah, it does seem like we've also even got like some of the things that led to how this could even happen, right? Like we hear about like this.
That was an interesting find when one of the students found this new
deregulation
law or the deregulation passed for truckers. So basically they didn't have to track their movements as much as they did previously. So their routes, their stops, their times and dates. which happened just before the
Yeah.
spate of killings.
Yeah, I actually looked this up
Spate.
because
Not spade of killings, spate of killings.
spate of killings. I looked this up. This is the Motor Carrier Act, which was signed into law in 1980 by Jimmy Carter when Jimmy Carter was still president. I just presume this happened in the 80s, and it was deregulation. It was Ronald Reagan that was kind of his whole thing was let's just take the federal government out of things. And I thought, oh, like that's an easy sort of connection to draw. Like Ronald Reagan, that's what he did, and that led to people being able to be serial killers as truckers. But actually, it was a Jimmy Carter law, and actually it was a law that had been in the works for like 10 years before across like 4 different presidents, I think. And when I looked it up, apparently everyone actually thinks this was a great law, that it saved people a bunch of money and allowed, like, there's a bunch of benefits to it where it allowed like people who couldn't get into trucking to get into trucking. It increased like diversity in some parts of the country in terms of truckers. It reduced costs of shipping, which helped like consumers. It had some negative like things too, like union membership fell and stuff like that. But it wasn't what I expected. And it also went further down a rabbit hole into the Motor Carrier Act than I probably would have. Something I'd never heard of before.
Yeah, I can tell you went down a rabbit hole on that one. From a teaching point of view, I love that he loves teaching. I thought it was so funny the way he was like, I don't like teaching, I love teaching. And if I love something, I think it's really important. I'm very serious about it. Just like I love food. I'm very serious about food. I was like, that's such a random like aside, but I just thought it was pretty funny. He seems to have a good sense of humor as well as being like a serious teacher. I loved his passion for the job. I think it's pretty amazing. I can't imagine how long this all takes to prep. Like the preparation to go in to do this project-based learning, even if you're not talking about a serial killer, it's a lot. So yeah,
can we talk about that for a second? I just in terms of, so you have a background in education and you know a little bit about project-based learning. You know how much work it is to prep as a teacher, right? And I mean, I think you did that for longer than I did that, but I'm curious, when you think about something like this and the idea of not just the work it took to put together this project for this class, but also just thinking about like, these are high school students. I think we hear from some of the students that their range of ages, they're not just like high school seniors, right? Like I think there's sophomores, juniors, seniors in this class. What do you think as a teacher? Like if you were one of this teacher's, in his department or in his school, and you heard that he was doing this case, like, what would be your reaction to this?
That's a really good question. I'm not really sure. I can imagine some people are not too happy about it. Like if kids are basically all enthusiastic about one class but not into the other. I also think it higher the standards, which is a terrible thing to say, but I can imagine certain people not being happy with a teacher who goes above and beyond, raises the standard to this level, and then maybe other teachers feel like, oh, now the student's expectation is that this is the level of work that every teacher puts in. And to be fair, a lot of people don't have the energy or maybe the enthusiasm for it, especially someone who's been teaching for as long as he has.
He's taught for over 20 years, I think he said.
I think if you put that much energy into your teaching for over 20 years, it's hard to imagine how you don't hit a burnout stage. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting question. I mean, if other teachers have an issue with it, who owns the problem, as my mother would say. He's passionate, and I think any way to get children, teenagers, kids interested in their own learning, asking to be taught something, which is what happened here. Like, that's pretty cool.
Let me ask you a different question. So how would you feel as a parent if your kid came home and said, this is what we're working on in my sociology class?
I think that's a hard question to answer. It would really depend on the child in question. I think at one point one of the students is mentioned to have been like a jock, maybe.
Yeah.
I picked up the inference, and maybe this is just from like the TV dramas over the years I've watched with jocks, etc. But maybe disengaged in their own learning, maybe don't really care about school that much, maybe only care about football. I know that's a lot of stereotypes. Don't come after me, jocks. But what, like, if my child wasn't engaged with his own learning or her own learning, and then they came home from school really enthusiastic about anything. It's like when they're reading, you know, the way you want your child to get into reading. You're like, I don't care. Read a magazine about dinosaurs, or read a novel, or read a book of poetry once it's not written by Ian Bailey. Any of those things are fine. But, you know, it's whatever's getting them engaged in their own learning. Whereas if my child was very academic and I was sorry, parents out there who are like this, an annoying parent who was all about them getting really high academic scores, and then my child was overly engaged with this silly project, which I'd imagine some parents felt like it was, I mightn't have such a positive attitude. So
I had a follow-up question. So something that doesn't come up here, and I'm curious to see if it does come up in later episodes, is I feel like, and maybe this is not true of this part of Tennessee, but I feel like we often hear a lot about, like, you know, some parts of the country where books get banned, or you know, there's certain subjects that you can't bring up in schools, and I've never really heard of anything like this, but also, like, this seems like a sensitive subject that I could see some parents not being comfortable, you know, particularly if they have, let's say they have a student who maybe it's some sort of like high risk group, or they're worried about their student's mental health, or something like that. Like, I'm thinking there are probably parents who would hear the subject matter of what's being taught in this class and be very uncomfortable with that. And I'm curious what kind of pushback he maybe got from either teachers or from the board or from his department chair. I don't know if maybe he is the department chair. But that kind of thing, I'm just kind of curious about that. We don't know that from this episode. Maybe we'll find out more as it goes.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking the same thing. My brain was more going to my limited knowledge of how things work over here in education. In schools is very much you have to hit certain standards and the kids have to learn certain things, and it's very rigid. And this feels not rigid. This feels like, oh, I often teach profiling in my class, so I'm going to do that while bringing in a case. And you know, the topic of prostitution came up, topic of vulnerability. I'm sure within that maybe the topic of drugs comes up. Like there seems to be a lot that would come up there, and I'd be interested to see how you can marry all that into aligning with the standards you're trying to teach to. And as you said, getting buy-in from everyone involved. But to be honest, it sounds like he runs the show.
It does. Yeah, it does. It also sounds like he's not the type of person who's going to back down from something he believes in that is the right thing for his students, right? Like, he seems like the type of teacher, and I think you and I probably both known these teachers who they have an idea and they're going to run with it, and whether you like it or not, and they're going to execute on it, and you just kind of have to get out of their way.
Yeah. Exactly. I would like to say, like, there was a number, I think maybe 4 or so students, 3 or 4 students we heard from throughout, and what I really enjoyed is the other thing, the other side of true crime, and when people are looking into it, which often we talk about a lot on the show, and it's often forgotten about, and that's respect. And I feel like, along with all of whatever they did for these cold cases, they really seem to show a level of respect. It was mentioned definitely 3 times how these are real people, these have families, or these are people who have no one speaking out for them anymore, and we have to treat these families and these victims with respect. And it was said so much that it made me, I don't know, I really liked that. I think it could be very easy, especially as a teenager, to be less aware of that.
Yeah, I actually almost wonder if it's easier for a teenager than, like, you know, someone in their 30s or 40s who's into true crime, who maybe has been sort of exposed to so much over their life that they're a little bit more jaded. Whereas these teenagers, I think, like, and this is my conjecture, but like some of them are probably like, they don't feel respected. They don't feel like the world takes them seriously or values them. And so they have maybe an innate empathy for these victims. And many of these victims, I think also I think some of them are young, like, the one
Cynthia was 16.
16, right. So high school age. And like, I guess I can imagine that some of those high school students can relate in some ways to, and they have that innate empathy that I think probably helps them be a little bit more sensitive than they might otherwise be. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting. I do wonder how, like, I really liked episode 1. I thought it was a really good opening episode. But so many fall off episode 1. I feel like we've seen that happen quite often. I really hope this show doesn't fall off after episode 1. I'm not confident in that though.
Why?
I don't know. Bad vibes. Even though I thought it was a great episode. I don't mean this to turn anyone else off listening to it, but because I thought it was an excellent episode, I'm bought in. And I think that's maybe the other thing I was going to ask you. We're both bought into this because we both have, well, I presume you're bought into this. I haven't actually asked you. Are you?
Yeah. No, I definitely am.
So we're both bought into this, but we've education backgrounds. I'm very into true crime. Apparently you now are too, because even when you're not listening to our podcast, you're listening to other true crime podcasts, but whatever. Would someone... This episode goes through a number of things I found really interesting. How he wanted to engage children straight off the bat, because if you don't get them engaged, they won't continue to be engaged further on. It went through the process of having the discussion in class. It went through the process of trying to get them to ask for help and ask to be taught something, and that's half the battle. It went through a lot of education teacher aspects. And I was wondering whether we were into it because of our backgrounds. Do you think other people would be as into it who have maybe no interest in education or teaching, or no knowledge of it other than being in school themselves?
Yeah, I actually wondered about that. I think we are more predisposed to be into this than the average person. The person who's not, doesn't come from education, doesn't come from a teaching background. I think that is true. I do think something that this one does, at least in its first episode, that, like, I was critical of the last one we listened to, Dead Man Running, for that. I think this one at least alludes to. I'm not sure if they're going to keep going down this path, but one of the things I was critical of in Dead Man Running was we talked about the criminal in that one, and how we heard about what he was like as a young man, what he was like as an adult, and there was like phase 1 and phase 3 of his life, and we're missing phase 2, like how he got from being this person that everyone liked and teachers said nice things about, and he had friends and all that, to a person who was horrible. Here in this first episode, we get some of that, right? The students are trying to figure out, why would someone do this kind of crime? What would lead them to this path? What about their childhood, about their relationship with their mother, about their relationship with their ex-girlfriend or wife, or, like, what is the profile of this person, which that's a topic that I am interested in. That's a topic that I'm curious about, because this is something, as we listen to more and more of these stories, I think something that keeps kind of, like, I come back to a lot is, how do you end up like this? How do you end up doing these horrible things? Not just, a crime of passion, but a serial killer, right? Like, this is someone who hunts, or they talk about it being a crime of opportunity, right? Like someone who is just has access
their
to
eye out.
Their what? Their eye out.
Keeping their eye out, yeah.
Yeah. Like, but the rest of us presumably don't do that, right? Like, I don't know what you're doing.
I love the way you're like, right? Like, Jeff, do you think I've any time to do anything other than this podcast on the rest of my life? No. just to fill that blanket.
I mean, I don't know. I know I don't, but it's not just about time. It's also about, like, I wouldn't, right? Like, there's lots of reasons.
Well, yeah. Can I also say that I also wouldn't?
You didn't lead with that, though, which is a little bit troubling.
It is a bit troubling. So moving on, go on.
I did think
I thought the behavioral analyst was very sound. I thought the whole profiling aspect was really interesting. I loved how the teacher isn't trying to be the expert in everything, but knows when it's time to bring someone else in who is an expert. Can't believe how much time he gave to the class. That was pretty impressive.
So that you're
what's
talking
the
about
behavioral analyst
Scott
name?
Parker, the FBI
Scott
behavioral
Parker.
analyst.
Yeah. He gave so much time to these kids and he was really impressed with them. He even gave time to help them grade their work. I just thought it was excellent. It's really, really cool. It would give, I'm sure, students a lot of enthusiasm in the project to see someone like, oh my God, the FBI are in to talk to us, to help us. And then they're saying that we're doing a great job. Like, come on, that's amazing. And I do have to agree. I think a lot of what you said, I agree with. One frustration I have to say with this was finding a sexy name.
Okay, we should talk about why that comes up.
So basically, there's 13 murders that have happened, or apparent murders, that some people believe could be tied together. They narrow it down to 6. And then they hold they bring in local media to update them, to try and get the news out there. And they're trying to figure out a name that will catch people's attention.
Right. But why are they doing that?
I don't know.
So they're doing that because I think it's stated briefly, and I think I missed this the first time I listened, but I caught this the second time. Because these murders happened 30 years ago, or more than 30 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And they're cold cases. The police have a lot of other stuff on their plate. They have a lot more recent crimes that they're investigating. And I think Alex Campbell's angle is, we're not going to get, there's no Matt Hutchison here, like the one we talked about, the Karen Stitt murder. There's no cop who is taking like his personal time or her personal time to investigate these cases. We need to get some media attention in order to get a little bit of fire under this, in order to get some actual like resources devoted to this. And the best way to do that is to give it a sexy name and get it out in the press and get people talking about it, get people actually wanting to find resolution to this crime.
Yeah, and I get that. First of all, I have an issue with the idea of a sexy name. I think it's really buying into the serial killer and kind of making them more of an appealing thing. Even like the phrase sexy name, like there's a catchy name. I don't know, whatever word you want to use. Didn't love that. And I also feel like they landed on the Bible Belt murders.
Strangler. Bible Belt
Strangler.
Yeah.
Issue I have with that is why isn't a victim focused?
That's a good point. Yeah. No, I can't disagree with that.
We don't want to make this Cretan.
No, Cretan's right. Yeah.
You don't want to put them on any high pedestal. You don't want to give them any time really in this. You have to give them some amount of time because you're researching them. I get that. But this, to me, just didn't sit well.
So, yeah, a different angle would have been to really focus on these women who were murdered and the crimes were never solved, right? Yeah, you're right. That would have been a different way to take it. Focus on maybe who they were. I think we don't know most of their names, right? Like we know very little about them, other than that they all had red hair. Mm-hmm. Like that's their one defining characteristic or similar characteristic. Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah. I was towards the end, so I was kind of already bought in, and then that kind of annoyed me a little bit frustrating, but definitely eager to keep listening. I've said it, I think this is my 3rd time. I'm just so intrigued as to how we're getting 12 episodes out of this.
Well, we'll have to cover that next time.
Mm-hmm.
We'll come back next time. We'll recap the next 11 episodes.
While we have you here, though, don't forget we're on Patreon. Come join us and support so we can continue to make all this fantastic content that you love so much. Patreon.com/so much crime, so little time.
And also, if you enjoyed this episode, please go and rate us, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen. Remember to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. That really helps us out. Thank you.
Okay, so this week, our true crime question of the week. Jeff, are you ready?
I am ready.
Murder 101, we're talking about a teacher who really engages his students by bringing these cold cases to them and asking them to work on them using what they know about sociology. This is pretty cool. What was the most engaging, cool thing you learned about when you were in high school?
So the thing that came to mind when you asked the question is, just in terms of a teacher, I think seemingly kind of went way far afield of what I would expect from the class, which I think was what some of these students talk about when they come into this sociology class. And I had a science teacher, and I want to say it was chemistry, although high school, as you've noted, was a long time ago for me, and it's a little hard to remember. I think it was my high school chemistry class, but this teacher was obsessed with the Titanic. So it had nothing to do with the class, but she spent, I think, the first 4 to 6 weeks of the class just totally going over Titanic history, about the ship, about how it hit the iceberg, about how people survived, about all the people who died, watching all these movies and things on it. And it was weird. It was weird how long it took us to get to, let's say it was chemistry, to actual chemistry, because that really had nothing to do with it. She was just fascinated by this, and she wanted to share her love of this topic with her students. And this was how we started the year. It was the very first thing we did. And
were you engaged in the learning at all, or were you just passively absorbing information about the Titanic?
I would say at the time, I remember thinking and saying to my friends, why are we doing this? This is weird. But also her enthusiasm was sort of infectious, right? Which I kind of get. Feel like in Murder 101, Alex Campbell probably has an infectious enthusiasm for what he's really just pumped about with his students. And I think that's kind of how it went with me, where it's yeah, I guess I kind of am into this. I didn't really care about the Titanic before, but now that we're here, sure. Also, I didn't really like chemistry, so this is maybe better than that. What about you, Dee? Do you have one? Can you remember high school? I know it's been a while.
Oh, I never went to high school, remember? I went to secondary school, which is what we call it in Ireland. I can't think of anything along these lines that is at top of mind. Did you? So I went to an all-girls Catholic school for secondary school, and we.
I didn't go to an all-girls Catholic secondary school.
So
was that the question? Was that what you were asking?
For our religion, in the second half, so from 4th year to 6th year, which is our second half of our teaching, religion just turns into drugs and sex ed basically for 3 years, and a little bit of Bible stuff thrown in there. But we were shown this video about, have you ever heard of Pam Stenzel?
No.
Okay, so she's some American Christian woman. She was trying to teach us all, or the audience, she was talking about how abstinence is the only form of safe sex, but she had some absolute crackers of quotes that me and the girls still say to each other. One is being, "But we love each other." No, that is not what you say. You say no. And then the other thing was that she was I put a Band-Aid on, I smack it on my arm and I lift it off, and look, there's a lot of dirt, there's a couple of hairs, blah, blah, blah. I put that Band-Aid on, I rip it off. Oh, it's not as sticky as anymore, and there's more dirt and more hairs. And this is kind of the line that we're going down. And these are the things that are etched in my memory now from religion class for the last 3 years of my schooling.
Is that Band-Aid a metaphor I think it is?
Yep.
Okay. Wow.
I know.
Okay.
It's wild. That's what sticks out in my mind.
That was amazing. Wow. All right.
Yeah.
On our next show, we'll discuss all of Murder 101.
Do these meddling kids get to the bottom of this mystery?
Can there finally be closure for the families of the victims?
That's on the next So Much Crime.
So Little Time.
So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of MimeGov Media. The executive producer is Paxton Calariso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show in your podcast app. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.